If you have ever observed four-stroke and two-stroke motorcycles, especially dirt bikes, you have probably noticed how four-stroke motorcycles have a pretty simple, uniform diameter exhaust pipe coming out from the engine, whereas two-stroke bikes have this very different-looking, kind of weird-shaped exhaust pipe with a big bulge on it. Well, here we have a two-stroke exhaust pipe with its expansion chamber. That's the big bulge on it. If you observe it a bit more closely, you can see that, well, it's still just a hollow pipe with varying diameters and zero moving parts. So you might be forgiven to think that this is a pretty simple object. It's just another weirdly shaped exhaust pathway, for the exhaust leaving the engine and going into the atmosphere. Well, in reality, the opposite is true, because this thing is one of the cleverest pieces of engineering ever made. And in this video, I will do my best to give you the most complete, but also the most easy to understand and most illustrative explanation of how these things actually work and how they manage to dramatically improve two-stroke engine performance by using nothing other than the sound of the engine itself. Okay, now to understand why two-stroke engines benefit from such exhaust pipes, we must first observe the two-stroke engine itself. That's a bit heavier than I expected. Okay, so here we have a two-stroke engine. Now, unlike a four-stroke engine, a two-stroke engine does not have valves or camshafts. The cylinder head of a two-stroke is essentially just a cap. Despite this simplified construction, the two-stroke manages to fire during every single revolution, which means that we have a combustion event every 360 degrees of engine rotation, whereas in a four-stroke, we have a combustion event only every 720 degrees of engine rotation. All of this means that a two-stroke is capable of achieving a better power-to-weight ratio than a four-stroke. But a two-stroke engine has a problem. Let's imagine that combustion has just occurred here inside this engine. So combustion pressure is building, it's acting on the piston, pushing it down, and torque is being created. The piston goes further down, and eventually it reaches the exhaust port and uncovers it. The highly pressurized gas inside the cylinder bursts out rapidly into the exhaust pipe. This is called the blowdown phase. During this phase, only the exhaust ports are slightly uncovered by the piston, whereas the transfer ports are not uncovered by the piston. In case you're unfamiliar with two-stroke engine operation, the only thing you really have to know to understand them is that they have an air-fuel mixture both above and below the piston. In a four-stroke, we only have the air-fuel mixture above the piston. When the piston goes down in a two-stroke, it compresses the air-fuel mixture below it, which then gets pushed into the transfer port, and finally exits out the transfer port and ends up above the piston when the piston uncovers the transfer port. But if we observe this particular moment in the operation of the two-stroke, we can see that we have a big problem. When the transfer port gets uncovered, the exhaust ports are also open at the same time, and there is nothing stopping the air-fuel mixture coming from the transfer port from going right out the exhaust. Of course, this is a massive loss of efficiency and performance because we're sending unburned fuel out into the atmosphere. We are essentially throwing away potential energy. Remember, we don't have any kind of valve that we can close in a two-stroke engine to prevent the air-fuel mixture from escaping right out through the exhaust port. So if we can't use a moving mechanical part, then we must use something else that engines have in abundance. And that is sound. As I'm sure you've noticed, engines make a lot of sound. And sound is a wave. So to understand the true nature of two-strokes, we must understand waves. Now, if I take this dish and fill it with water. And then I take this object and place it in the water and move that object. You can see that I'm creating waves. Waves are essentially local disturbances in a medium. In this case, the water in the dish is our medium. And as you can see, we are disturbing that medium. Waves move matter around in the medium, but they do not move the medium itself from one place to another. Of course, if the disturbance is significant enough, we can displace parts of the medium outside the container. Just like real waves can cause damage on the shore, even though the entire ocean doesn't move from one place to another. Okay, so this is a wave. More specifically, it's a mechanical wave. Water waves, sound waves, and earthquake or seismic waves are all examples of mechanical waves. Mechanical waves need a suitable medium to propagate through. Without a suitable medium, such as water, air, or even a solid object, mechanical waves cannot exist. This is why in outer space you wouldn't be able to hear me even if I screamed right next to your ear. And that's because outer space is a vacuum. There's no air in it, so sound waves have nothing to propagate through, which means that we're all deaf in outer space. But we're not blind because light can still travel through outer space, and that's because light is not a mechanical wave, it's an electromagnetic wave, and electromagnetic waves do not need a medium to propagate through, but we don't really care about that right now because two-stroke engines, they don't really operate in outer space, they operate in the atmosphere of planet Earth, which is filled with air, a very suitable medium for sound waves. But there's still a little catch. Yes, water waves and sound waves are both mechanical waves, but they're different kinds of mechanical waves. A water wave is a transverse wave because, as you can see, its amplitude, which is essentially the height of the wave or the size of the crest and trough of the wave, occurs perpendicular to the direction in which the wave is traveling. So the wave is moving this way, but the crest and trough are rising and sinking in a different direction. We can create transverse waves in water because, as you can see, water has a surface. But air does not have a distinguishable surface. It's simply everywhere around us. And that's why sound waves traveling through air are not transverse waves. They are longitudinal waves. Let's imagine a pipe filled with air. And now we send a sound wave through that pipe. Of course, the sound wave will disturb the molecules as it travels through the pipe. But as you can see, the disturbance created by the wave is in the same direction as the direction in which the wave is traveling. As you can see, the disturbance created by the sound wave compresses the molecules as it travels. It brings them closer together, which means that it creates a localized increase in pressure. This is why sound waves can also be called pressure waves. Whenever you create some sort of sound, you're actually creating pressure waves which propagate through the air outward from the source. Your ears, they catch and sense these pressure waves, and then your brain interprets them as different sounds. But it's very important to understand that transverse waves and longitudinal waves, they get reflected differently when they hit a different medium or a change in the existing medium. And as you will see, wave reflection is going to be very important later in the video. Okay, yes, I did just spend a big part of a video about exhaust pipes without saying a single word about exhaust pipes. But now you understand waves, and that's gonna make this next part so much easier and so much more enjoyable. So here we have our engine, and here we have our exhaust pipe. If you observe two-stroke exhaust pipes, you will see that they all start with a section of uniform diameter, which then diverges or expands into the largest diameter, which is the expansion chamber, and then finally again reduces in diameter or converges. When the piston first uncovers the exhaust ports and the blow-down phase begins, the exhaust gas, of course, rapidly bursts out through the tiny opening. This creates a loud, powerful sound or noise, and as we know, sound is a pressure wave. So we get a pressure wave coming out of the engine going through the exhaust pipe. Various explanations you might have encountered may have used terminology such as exhaust pulse or combustion pulse or similar. And while these are not necessarily correct, they can help you visualize things, but this terminology becomes useless later in the explanation. Because what comes out of the engine when the exhaust port opens is in fact a sound wave, which is a pressure wave. Here you can see an image shot using a special photography method that shows the end of an exhaust pipe releasing exhaust gas into the atmosphere. Here you can see, separate from the exhaust gas, the actual pressure wave, which is produced by the noise, by the sound of the engine. The pressure wave is only later followed by the actual exhaust gas. Remember, waves are disturbances of the medium, not the medium itself. The exhaust gas inside the exhaust pipe is our medium. And yes, the medium itself is moving in this case, but the sound wave or the pressure wave generated by the engine travels faster than the medium. And it can propagate into other mediums too, such as the metal of the exhaust pipe or the atmospheric air outside the engine. So the pressure wave is traveling through the pipe. It remains pretty constant through this initial uniform part of the pipe. After this, it reaches the diverging or the expanding section of the pipe. So what happens here? Here we have a change in the medium. Our medium is gas, and if the pipe diverges, our volume increases, which means that the molecules of the gas in this space are further apart. In other words, the gas is less dense here. And whenever a wave encounters a different medium or a change in the medium itself, the wave or part of the wave gets reflected back. You have probably experienced echo at some point in your life. And echo is just a sound wave traveling through the air, which is one medium, and then let's say it reaches a stone wall, which is a different medium. When a sound wave transitions from one medium to a different medium, part of it gets reflected back, so you hear your own voice again. But here's the important bit. When a longitudinal mechanical wave, such as a sound wave, transitions from a medium of higher acoustic impedance to a medium of lower acoustic impedance, part of it will get reflected back in the opposite direction, but the sound wave will also undergo a phase change. You can think of acoustic impedance simply as a medium's resistance to wave propagation. The higher the impedance, the harder it is for a mechanical wave to propagate through that medium. For example, a rock has a higher acoustic impedance than air. Also, denser air has a higher acoustic impedance than less dense air. Since the molecules are packed closer together in denser air, it is harder for the wave to propagate through it. A phase change means that a wave changes its nature. Now, a compressive wave is a positive pressure wave. In other words, it increases the local gas pressure by packing the molecules closer together. When a compressive wave undergoes a phase change, it will become an expansive wave or a negative pressure wave, one that reduces local pressure by spreading the molecules further apart. When that longitudinal compressive sound wave encounters the diverging section of the pipe, it transitions from a higher density gas to a lower density gas, or from a medium with a higher acoustic impedance to a medium with a lower acoustic impedance. When this happens, part of the compressive wave continues through the pipe, but part of it gets reflected back to the cylinder as a negative pressure wave moving in the opposite direction. This negative pressure wave reduces pressure of the gas as it travels back to the cylinder, and of course it reduces pressure inside the cylinder when it reaches the cylinder. To understand this better, you can think of the exhaust pipe as your lungs. What do you do with your lungs when you want to breathe in? Of course, you expand your lungs. They expand to create empty space inside them, which can then be filled with atmospheric air. When the lungs expand, they're essentially creating a negative pressure wave or an expansive wave which travels out from your lungs through your nose or your mouth and into the atmosphere outside. When it does that, it pulls in air into your lungs as it travels outward, this negative pressure wave. And as you can see, the exhaust pipe also expands here, hence the negative pressure wave. While the compressive wave was traveling through the exhaust pipe, the piston was of course moving down, and the arrival of the reflected negative pressure wave to the cylinder is timed so that it reaches the cylinder just as the transfer ports open. The negative pressure wave reduces pressure inside the cylinder, which increases the pressure difference between the air-fuel mixture in the transfer ports and the cylinder, which helps to pull in or inhale more air and fuel from the transfer port, and more air and fuel, of course, equals more power. So now we have air and fuel inside the cylinder, while the exhaust ports are still open, and the original or incident compressive wave is still traveling down the expansion chamber. Eventually, it reaches the converging section, or the section where the pipe reduces in diameter. Now the opposite thing happens to air density. As the pipe converges, the volume reduces, which means that we have higher air density and thus a higher acoustic impedance in the narrower section compared to the broadest section of the pipe. And when a longitudinal pressure wave transitions from an area of lower acoustic impedance to an area of higher acoustic impedance, part of it will be reflected back in the opposite direction as before, but this time there will be no phase change. In other words, the reflected wave will not turn into an expansive or negative pressure wave. It will remain a compressive or a positive pressure wave. Of course, we time the arrival of this reflected compressive wave coming from the convergent section of the pipe so that it arrives at the cylinder right at the time when the air and fuel mixture is trying to escape the cylinder through the still open exhaust ports. The compressive wave arrives right at the cylinder before the exhaust ports close. It increases pressure right outside the cylinder, which prevents the air and fuel mixture from getting out, so we essentially keep more air and fuel inside the cylinder thanks to the compressive wave, and more air and fuel is always more performance. So that's how the shape of the pipe allows us not just to suck in more air and fuel, but also to keep that same air and fuel inside the cylinder during the compression stroke. That's great, but we still have a problem. As you probably know, reciprocating piston engines operate over a very wide range of RPM. For example, this 300cc two-stroke goes anywhere between 800 to 10,000 RPM, which means that we have a great variation in the duration of the individual engine strokes, intake, compression, combustion, and exhaust. On the other hand, the speed of sound inside the pipe is pretty much constant, especially when the engine warms up. And that means that we can only really perfectly time the arrival of the compressive and the expansive sound waves at the cylinder over a very narrow range of RPM. In fact, you can actually hear this problem.
Okay, I want you to listen to the engine carefully now. I'm gonna ride at a very low RPM, very little throttle. Listen. I think you can hear how the engine is hesitating, how it sounds like it's sputtering. It's obviously not in its happy place. And that's because neither the compressive nor the expansive waves are arriving at the correct time, which means that we're not sucking in as much air and fuel as we could, and we're also spitting out more of it out of the cylinder. We get suboptimal combustion and weak torque. Now listen to what happens when I add just a tiny bit of throttle. This was absolutely minimal throttle, and we actually got a uncorrespondingly large amount of torque. And that's because the compressive, let's hear that again, sputtering, 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 tiny bit of throttle, and we get into what's known as the power band. What actually happens in the power band is that the compressive and the expansive waves start arriving at a more correct time. So we keep more air in the cylinder, and that gives us more power much better torque, and the engine smooths out.
So there you have it, using the sound of the engine to increase the power of the engine. Now, I have given my best to give you a easily digestible explanation of these pretty complicated concepts. But even video, despite its ability to transfer both image and sound, is ultimately somewhat limited. And that's because video can never be interactive. But fortunately, Brilliant is very much interactive, which is why I believe it can be a very valuable addition to anyone's learning toolbox. Because scientific research has repeatedly shown interactive learning to be the most effective way of absorbing new, complicated, and unfamiliar information and concepts. Now, Brilliant doesn't just adapt to your individual learning goals, it also covers an extremely wide range of topics, anything from math to computer science to engineering, programming, AI, and more, which of course makes it perfect for students, people making a career change, but it's also really perfect for anyone looking to genuinely understand and interact with the concepts that shape our world. What's also really nice is that if you go to brilliant.org/D4A, you can try Brilliant for a full 30 days completely free with all of the features to see if you like it and if it suits you. And if it does suit you, then accessing it through this same link will also give you 20% off an annual subscription.